Hey everybody. This is that recorded lesson that I told you were going to hear my voice and you were going to see my screen. And you can see that I've used a Google slideshow to try to get some information in order. So what I need you to do first is get out your textbook. This is a way for me to be able to let you see some images while I'm talking, and then you're just not hearing my voice. All right, so go ahead, get your textbook out from the desk, turn to page 546. Okay, pause this video while you are turning to that page. 546. And what you'll see is you'll see a map that looks like this. Okay, so pause the video right now and turn to page 546. So once you've turned to this page and you see this map in front of you, first of all, what type of map is this? Hopefully in your mind you said physical, because what we're seeing are some landform formations. Most specifically, what this map is showing us is right here, it's showing us elevation. So when we see the blue, that's going to be below sea level. Remember, sea level is the surface of the ocean. So at 0 feet, I wish they would have put sea level, because sea level is 0 feet. So that's going to be this boundary in between green and blue. So what we would see right in here, in between where you have a sea and it's meeting the land, or where you're having the ocean meet the land, this would be sea level. And then as our colors change from green to a yellow green to a yellow to an orange and then to finally red, that's where we're going up in elevation. So we're going up higher from the surface of the ocean, with red being our highest point on this map, and that represents 10,000 feet. So if we look and we try to find some of these areas that are 10,000 feet or, higher than 10,000 feet, because 10,000 feet is right here in between the orange and the red. So really the red represents above 10,000 feet. So if we look for these colors, we see them here. Okay, we see them over here, through here, over here. So what landforms does that represent? Well, we see that it says mountains, mountains. Something called Kush, I'll talk about that later. But these are going to be where our mountains are, where we see the red. Makes sense, because mountains are tall. We see a lot of green right here, and green represents being really close to sea level, right there at that coastline. And you can even see that right here it says depression. And we see a little bit of blue right there, because that's going to be below sea level. A lot of what we see here stays, in between the green, the yellow green, and the yellow. So in between 0 and 2,000 feet in elevation. It's not until you get over here in Iraq, Afghanistan, and right here in Morocco, that you're going to see really tall places. All right, if I point out, and I left off those mountains, sorry about that. I want to point out latitude. Okay, so latitude, we see 0 degrees right here. We see 0 degrees latitude, and that marks the equator that's going to cut through the African continent. Okay, and you notice that the continents are written in all black, bold, all caps. Europe, there's our continent of Europe. Asia would be over here, and it would extend off the page. And Africa, all of this is Africa. But you notice that they wrote Africa south of the Sahara. The Sahara is this really big desert that goes through this area, right through here. So north, or part of the Sahara, all of this part gets included with the Middle East that we've talked about because they share a lot of cultural similarities, their religion, their food, their art, their architecture, their music, even their language. Is going to be similar in this area. But as we see, the people that live south of the Sahara, down in this part of Africa, we're going to talk about that after spring break, and we're going to see that their culture is different than people north of the Sahara or within the Sahara up here. So when I use that acronym MENA, M-E-N-A, this would be Middle East, right here. This would be North Africa, right here. Some geographers argue that the Middle East is everything that you see in color right here. It's this part plus North Africa. Some people argue that, some geographers argue that the Middle East is right here. Some argue that it extends upward into Asia a little bit more. So for our purposes, we're going to say that the Middle East is this, North Africa is this, and MENA is everything that we see. Just like with Europe, we see a lot of peninsulas. The Anatolian Peninsula right here, the Arabian Peninsula, which is all of this area through here. Okay, and something called the Sinai Peninsula, that little bitty baby part of Egypt that I told you went with Asia, because the rest of this is Egypt. This is the rest of Egypt. But this little bitty baby part of Egypt is something called the Sinai Peninsula. All right, so if we look at the map on the next page, on page 547, one right beside this one, what type of map is this? Pause, long pause. Hopefully in your brain you said political, especially since it says it on the page in red right down here under the Atlantic Ocean. So this is a political map. This is showing us boundaries where governments have control. So if I'm talking about Egypt, everything in red, including that Sinai Peninsula right there, everything in red is controlled by the Egyptian government. Right here, everything in yellow is controlled by the Turkish government. Everything over here in red is controlled by the Iranian government. Okay, so these political boundaries show us the extent of a government's power. So this is that Middle East area right here that we've talked about. Remember, there were 20 countries in this area. Here's Northern Africa. Again, I want to point out the equator right here. So everything we're talking about is in the northern hemisphere because it's above the equator. I want to point out that a lot of the cities, and remember, what does the star mean? Hopefully you said that that's the capital city right there. National capital is the white star. Big black dots are just major cities. So not capitals, but still really important cities to that country. So if I'm looking at Northern Africa and I see Morocco is right here. Okay, it's the country in Africa that's almost touching Spain. Okay, it's that Strait of Gibraltar that cuts in between them. But Morocco is the part of Africa almost touching Spain. Rabat is it's going to be its capital. Notice it's right on the coast. Okay, so let's look at Algeria. Its capital is Algiers, again, right on the coast. Tunisia's capital is Tunis, right on the coast. Libya's capital is Tripoli, right on the coast. So then why would these capital cities be on the coast? Why aren't they down here or in the west or in the east? Why are they all right along this coastline? Think about that for just a second. And I'm going to have a long, awkward pause right here while you think. And hopefully, while you are thinking, you're thinking, oh, they're by the water. By the water. by the water, by the water, by the water. Cairo isn't on the coast, but look, it's right here along the Nile River. Look at all these white stars right there along the water source. Okay, over here, all along the water source. The reason that these capital cities, or even, if we get over here and we see some black dots that aren't capitals, but they are major cities, the reason that they're by the water source is because as this area developed over time and population increased over time, as people moved here or decided to trade here, the waterways were like roads. That's how trade occurred. These European countries would sail across the Mediterranean and land on the coast. So it didn't make sense for people to live here if they wanted to trade, because Europeans weren't going to trek across this land if they didn't have to. It made sense for them to be along the coast. So that made trade easier. Also, it was water, right? We've talked about that in the past, how water was necessary for life. It was necessary for cooking, cleaning, but also because of trade. If we look close, remember the continent names are written in big, all bold letters. The country names are written a little smaller. Again, though, still all in caps and bolded, just written a little smaller. Well, look at Western Sahara right here. You see how it's written in all caps, but it's not bolded. That's because there's a little bit of conflict. Morocco claims it, which is why Morocco is written in red, but there are some disputes on whether or not this is its own country. We also on this map see one territory. That's going to be right here, the Canary Islands. They are a territory. Notice that they're written in all bold, but they're not written in all caps. And they also have a country name underneath. And that country name of Spain, that's telling me who claims them as a territory. So the Canary Islands right here are claimed by Spain. And Spain is this country right here in that on that Iberian Peninsula in Europe. So let's talk about some issues. And you're going to see me do some underlining on here. Please don't write in the book. It's just so I can bring your attention. So this is page 573. So if you'll turn to 573, and if you need to pause the video, go ahead and pause it right here. So hopefully you're on page 573. And you see at the top that it says issues. Okay, again, please don't write in the book. So it says issues. The period since World War II has brought a great deal of change and conflict to Southwest Asia. Remember, Southwest Asia is the same thing as the Middle East. So they've got some issues. First thing is going to be oil. So we see oil dependency and control. So the discovery in the mid-1900s of vast deposits. Vast means a lot, huge, big, gigantic deposits of petroleum. Petroleum. That's just the fancy science word. And sorry, I'm having to do this with a mouse. That's the fancy science word for oil and natural gas. So in the mid-1900s, so mid meaning middle, so 1950, that would be like mid-1900s. The discovery in the mid-1900s of vast, huge deposits of petroleum, of oil in Southwest Asia had a strong impact on the region. So they would export this oil. Let me erase some of this. Exports of petroleum have brought great wealth. So what is wealth? If you have a lot of wealth, that means you're what? rolling in the money. Okay, so they have gotten a lot of wealth, a lot of money in these countries around the Persian Gulf where the largest deposits are. So, oil, I want you to remember this, equals money. So these countries that have a lot of oil have a lot of money. But here's the thing. Petroleum, this discovery of petroleum has brought some challenges to the area. So you had these people that were living in really modern cities. All of a sudden, their area is really wealthy, but they grew up living in tents and they practiced traditional farming and herding. And so it's really at odds with how they grew up. They grew up in this kind of environment where they were self-sufficient and they grew everything that they needed to eat. And all of a sudden, there's this huge influence of money. And they're like, this is corrupting our way of life, all of this money. So you also see this big divide between the really rich countries that have a lot of oil and the poorer countries that don't. So right here it says Qatar and Kuwait, for example, rank among the wealthiest countries in the world, whereas Afghanistan ranks among the poorest. And that comes down to this struggle between who controls the oil. Again, remember, this oil is found underground. So you may be pulling up oil along the border, in Kuwait, but it's pulling oil from underneath another country. Remember, I talked about that happening with water as well. So then you have this tension between countries. They're saying, no, we control the oil. No, we do. Back and forth. No, it's ours. No, it's ours. Well, we're pulling it up on our country. Yeah, but you're pulling it up underneath our country. So one other thing that goes with oil is the dependency on that money. So they have all of this oil money, but what happens when countries decide they don't want to become they want to become green countries and they don't want to be dependent on oil and they don't want to buy oil from these countries anymore? What's going to happen in these countries when that oil money goes away, if it goes away? So that's something that they have to think about. So you're going to take a break from hearing my voice for a little while because you've been listening to it for 18 minutes. And go back to my pointer. And we're going to do something. Oh, I did not know it. Let me erase. Sorry. Get that off the screen. So you picked up this paper, or the sub passed it out, or maybe not. Maybe she said you had to go to the front and get it when it was time. But you have this handout today. Well, I'm erasing all this. Man, I wish I could make this eraser bigger. Okay, so you have this handout today, and you've got a little bit up here to read. Just point out some things. Oil is a fossil fuel. You've talked about that in science. It's often called black gold, not because it's gold, it's black. That's why it's called black gold. But it's often called that because gold in people's minds equates money. So black gold, oil equals money. Remember, I just erased that from over here. Oil equals money. So on the front, you have this chart of the top 10 oil-producing countries in Asia. Later on this week, you're going to see the top producing countries in Africa, okay, because that is part of what we're talking about, Northern Africa. But this is the top ones in Asia, top 10. And you'll notice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of the top 10 in all of Asia. 6 of the top 10 are in the Middle East. And this shows you how many barrels they produce in a day. So what I want you to do is get this paper, read the front, use the front to answer questions on the back. You're going to see part A has 10 questions, part B has 3. So pause this video, get that paper. If it takes you the rest of class, it takes you the rest of the class. I want you to really focus on this. After you're done, I need you to put it behind divider 3. You're going to need it later in the week because you're going to see this same paper, except it's going to be over Africa. So you're going to need it later. Don't lose it. Don't turn it in. Okay, I don't want it to get lost somewhere in the shuffle because I'm not there. I want you to put it behind divider 3 so you don't lose it. All right, so you've got 13 total questions that go with the graph on the front. So pause this video, do this graph, and then come back to this video because I still need to talk about terrorism, ISIS, and water scarcity in this region. All right, so hopefully you completed that page. You put it behind divider 3. I want you to get your textbook back out. It may still be out if you still have time on Monday. Some of you, it may have taken you all the rest of the class period to do that paper, and it may be Tuesday right now. I don't know. You're kind of going at your own pace since I'm not there. So if it's Tuesday or if you put your textbook up, pause this video for a second and turn to page 574. So on page 574, first thing I want to talk about is this picture at the top. You see these long pipes on wheels that are going to roll, and they're spraying. You can see the spray of water. I talked about that word irrigation and how the Sumerians were some of the first ones in Mesopotamia, in between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, to develop irrigation. And this is an example of modern irrigation. So the Sumerians didn't do all this fancy equipment. They had channels that would kind of tunnel the water to where they wanted it to go. But this is more modern irrigation. And what that does is it allows, and you can see in this picture, all this desert area here and here in the foreground of the picture. What irrigation allows for is it allows for farming to take place in areas that don't receive a lot of rainfall. So they are pulling this water from somewhere around there in order to grow these crops. Okay, and so I'm going to come back to that picture in just a moment because it technically goes with this page over here. But I wanted to point it out because I knew you'd be studying it instead of listening to what I was saying about down here. So we hear a lot about terrorism and terrorists and ISIS in the Middle East. So to give you a little bit of background information about that, you have this section on page 574 that's titled Changing Governments. And it talks about something called the Arab-Israeli conflict. I wish it had a highlighter, but it doesn't. The Arab-Israeli conflict is this big fight in between these two groups. And if you listen to the news, or sometimes on Channel 1, they talk about West Bank or the Gaza Strip. These are territories that are being fought over. So the second paragraph down here, it says, Israel captured both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967, but withdrew its forces from Gaza in 2005. 2 years later, Palestinian Arab voters in the Gaza Strip elected to power an anti meaning against, so an anti-Israel Islamic group called Hamas. This group has staged terrorist attacks on and fired rockets into Israel, forcing Israel to defend itself. And eruptions of violence have limited progress towards a peaceful solution. So remember when I talked about Israel, that's home to what religion? Awkward pause. Hopefully you're thinking about the Jewish people. Israel is home to the Jewish people. Remember, all the countries around there are majority Muslim, the Islamic religion, except for Israel. So you're having this conflict in between the Jewish people and the Muslim people, and that's going to be the Arab-Israeli conflict. And so they're going back and forth. I told you that they've been fighting for years and years and years. And you can see 1967, that was a long time ago. That was before even Miss Hamilton was born. A long time conflict in this area. And it's still going on. You know, they're still fighting in this area. We still have terrorists. We know that. And when you hear ISIS, okay, this terrorist group, ISIS, you know, we heard about Al Qaeda when 9/11 happened, but now we hear about ISIS. So I want you to go back to Google Classroom and watch the ISIS video link that is along with this lecture. Watch that video link, and it's going to give you a brief description. It's like 5 minutes long. A brief description of ISIS, what ISIS is, how it developed, and how it is changing the face of the Middle East currently. So pause this video, go to Google Classroom, watch that ISIS video, and then come back to this video. All right, so that ISIS video gave you a little bit of an overview. Hopefully it put it in simple enough terms, because this is a very complicated conflict. You know, it's this constant back and forth between these countries and these people, and a lot of innocent people that want peace. They really just want peace. They want the fighting to stop. They're caught in between these governments fighting each other. Another issue in this area is water. Water is a huge issue. So on the next page, on page 575, it starts off with this word scarcity right here. Let me get my pencil back up. Scarcity. And I wrote a definition of scarcity right here, or typed it. Scarcity means a lack of. There's just not a lot of it. It's scarce. Okay, scarcity goes with the word scarce. If something is scarce, it's not there. So scarcity of fresh water. Well, they have salt water. They're there beside the Mediterranean Sea, which is salty. They're there in between, the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, which are salty. But they have this scarcity of fresh water. And it's really affected the makeup of that area, who lives where and what they do there. And it's so let me just read. The scarcity of fresh water has plagued Southwest Asia throughout history. So all of history. Remember, we talked about in between the Tigris and Euphrates was that area of Mesopotamia when the rivers would overflow. So that's why people lived there. Okay, those rivers would overflow with fresh water from snowmelt from the mountains. And so people lived there. So dramatic population growth has produced greater demand for this precious resource, making the situation more dire and increasing the importance of hydropolitics. So what does this root word hydro mean? Awkward pause. Hopefully you're thinking in your mind water. Hydro means water. So hydropolitics are politics that have to do with water. Water politics. It's literally what that word means. So they can take water from the salt water, okay, and it goes through this process right here called desalination. Just pretend like you can see through it. Desalination is the removal of salts, and there's different types of salts. That's why I'm calling it salts, plural. The removal of salts from ocean water, from salt water. But desalination is really, really expensive. expensive. And you're like, okay, well, they've got oil money, right? Not everybody. Remember, like Afghanistan was very poor because they don't have the same oil money that Kuwait and Qatar have. So desalination is super, super expensive. So it's a possibility, but if you're one of those poor countries, it's not really an option for you. There's something called fossil water. So when you hear the word fossil, what do you think? Hopefully you think of like the little shells stuck in rocks. You talked about that last year in 5th grade science. You talked about fossils and they form in sedimentary rocks. Fossil water kind of goes along those same lines as fossils. We consider fossils to be thousands or even millions of years old. Fossil water is water that fell a long, 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 long time ago, thousands of years ago, back when this region had a little bit different climate, and it got trapped in between layers underground, kind of like oil gets trapped in between rock layers underground. So they can actually tap into fossil water, but in science, you learn that water is a renewable resource, right? Because, it's going to evaporate and then it's going to fall as precipitation again. And so water is considered to be a renewable resource. It should always be around. But here's the catch with fossil water. Fossil water is not, right here, fossil water is not a renewable natural resource because it's just trapped water. Once you pull it out from in between those rock layers, it's going to be gone, okay? Because the climate is now different, so we're not going to have trapped water anymore. Okay, so fossil water is not renewable, unlike just water in our atmosphere and water in the oceans and waters in lakes. All of that water is renewable. So the greatest source of fresh water, here we go again. We see this river system that's so important, the Tigris-Euphrates river system. All right. They are going to get their water from the mountains, from that snow melt. And so that's going to be the most important. Let me see if I can go back. See if it'll let me go back. Let me point out. Sorry, that was crazy. Here's the Tigris. Here's the Euphrates. So the majority of fresh water in this area is coming from those two rivers. And when it's more than one river, it's called a river system. Okay. So let me go back to that slide. So that's really key for the people in this area to have fresh water. The 3 countries depend, and the 3 countries that they're talking about is Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. So these 3 countries depend heavily on the rivers and their tributaries, which are just little like baby rivers that go off of them, off the main river. In recent decades, all have built dams to control flooding, generate electricity, and capture water for irrigation. Remember this picture over here. Syria and Iraq, which are downstream from Turkey, have bitterly, which means they are really, really super against, they bitterly opposed an ambitious decades-long dam building project in Turkey. Because since they're downstream, if Turkey builds a dam, then that's going to affect how much water gets down to Syria and Iraq. So there's a lot of fighting in this area over water, because if they dam it in one country, it's going to affect how much of that fresh water gets to the other countries. Okay, so in this lecture, you've heard me talk about, go back, oil. Okay, so remember that oil equals what? Hopefully you said money. All right, but not every country has an equal amount of oil, so that's going to lead to some conflict. Changing governments, the fighting in between the Jewish people and the Muslim people in this area. It's just constant fighting that has to do with religion. And then water, this severe lack, this scarcity of fresh water in this area. And going into dams. And you'll hear me talk about dams again when I talk about North Africa, because there's also this scarcity of fresh water there. So scarcity of water, conflict between religions, and conflict because of oil. These are the major concerns in this area.